don't fall. That's when you know you're gonna go dry. Till the rain don't fall. That's when you know you're gonna go dry. And it won't do no good to be crying out loud, babe, or cursing the sky.
Hi, welcome to Thinking Green. We're pre-taping this show, but figured out after we had scheduled it already that it will be airing on Tax Day, which is really appropriate and was totally unplanned, because today's show is about money, including tax money and governmental money. So I'm joined today by Paul Rubin, and he's going to talk about modern monetary theory and how many of us and many of our leaders are getting it wrong.
Yeah.
So welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much for the welcome and the opportunity to talk to you about modern monetary theory.
It was kind of in the news recently that Elon Musk, who is running a department that's supposed to make the government more efficient, discovered these magic money-making machines.
Yes.
So what do you think about all that?
It's really ironic because it's what a lot of economists, not a lot of economists, a small section of economists, modern monetary theorists, have been saying for about 25 years. That the government spends by creating money basically out of nothing, by typing numbers into spreadsheets, not by taxing revenues or anything like that. And so it was very ironic that he found these, what he called magic money computers in all these departments. But of course, Musk and Trump are not using it, regardless of whether they found this kind of sort of reality. They're not using it towards the public's benefit, and they're slashing the public sector. They're imposing really grotesque levels of austerity, which is we've already seen, an enormous amount of the harm that it's done, and we, in addition to the tariffs and all that kind of stuff.
So they discovered it, but they really didn't learn a thing from it.
Not a thing. Not a thing.
Now we have a slide of Margaret Thatcher, who I guess was coming from a little, pretty much the same place as Trump and Musk.
Yes.
And maybe we can show that slide,
Yes.
And maybe read what she had to say.
Yeah, it's instructive. It's really important because it's instructive to how people have thought about public money for the last 40, 50 years, and how it's misinformed policy, how it's misinformed the public about where money comes from, and how it can be used. So yes, this was in 1983. She was speaking to the Conservative Party conference, and she said, "Let us never forget this fundamental truth: the state has no source of money other than money which people earn themselves. If the state wishes to spend more, it can do so only by borrowing your savings or taxing you more. It is no good thinking that someone else will pay. That someone else is you. There is no such thing as public money. There is only taxpayers' money." And it's a really, really famous phrase that's been kind of repeated by the likes of Ronald Reagan and Milton Friedman and all these I would call bad actors who use this kind of misunderstanding of money, specific public money, as an excuse to rationalize austerity, as an excuse to rationalize privatization. And so they say, well, we can't fund healthcare. We'd have to tax you more, and there is no ability to do that. Or would you rather see your tax dollars be going to this or that, when the reality is very different?
Well, it is kind of ironic, though, that Reagan and Thatcher, the people who preach austerity, have actually not created so-called balanced budgets as much as the Democrats have.
Right.
So,
Right.
although austerity has not been a stated goal of most Democratic administrations, the way they functioned actually has not supported
True.
what they're saying.
And what a modern monetary theorist would basically say, it's not about balancing the budget. You could have a budget surplus, or you could have a budget deficit. What's more important is balancing our economy. Whether this is a phrase from famous economists who, one of the economists who contributed to modern monetary theory. A lot of the concepts have always been with us, it's just we forgot them. Modern MMT comes from John Maynard Keynes. It comes from George Knapp, who was before him, who talked about chartalism. It comes from Hyman Minsky, who talked about functional finance, and Abba Lerner. And what Hyman Minsky was talking about is that you want the government to be using the public purse for the public benefit. And we don't have that. And obviously we have a government that's run by and for and of corporate interests. I would argue that we've probably never had a democracy, but particularly now, it's more obvious than ever we have an oligarchy that's operating for its own self-interest.
And even, I guess people would point to the FDR days and
Yes.
government spending
Yes.
us out of a depression.
Yes,
So,
100%.
but even then, like when Social Security was started, that was a bridge too far to just fund as a government program.
Well,
Or-
it's ironic. You know, when FDR came into power, we were in a massive depression. He didn't he created millions of government jobs. He created first unemployment insurance, Social Security Act, first minimum wage. All these government programs and all this new spending. There was never the assumption. There was never the demand for citizens to pull up their bootstraps and contribute a little bit more. Here, we spent ourselves out of depression. Obviously, World War II had a large amount to do with pulling us out of depression as well. But an MMT perspective would be, ironically, that in order to pull yourself out of, for the government to respond to recessions, to depressions, it actually needs to spend more, not less, which is very counterintuitive. But it's one of the reasons why after the Great Recession in 2008, it took so long to recover. Some of Obama's advisors were encouraging him to actually spend more than he actually did. And some of that restraint about the fear of the deficits, the fear of how are we going to pay for this, actually ended up prolonging the recession a lot longer than it had to.
And I'm thinking about the results of the Depression. Some of the things that were purchased with this buying us out of depression are things that have sort of kept enriching our lives. You know, you go into the New London
Definitely.
post office and the murals were part of that.
WPA and
and Conservation Corps, you go
Yep.
into a lot of parks. I think Bates Woods, which we've also had a show about, has campsites that were not directly funded by the federal government,
Sure.
but there were more local programs that mirrored those.
Yep.
Different kinds of job programs funded from different sources.
Yep.
And what was built and produced during that time has a lot of it stayed with us.
Yeah, 100%. And, there's a quote from John Maynard Keynes when he was talking about, he wrote a book, How to Pay for the War. And his point, which is basically, again, he wasn't an MMTer, he was 60 years or when he wrote How to Pay for the War. This was a long time before modern monetary theory ever came up. But he had a famous quote that anything that we can actually do we can pay for. So the idea is not finding the money for a currency issuing government like the United States, like many around the world, Japan, China, Australia, the UK, sovereign currency issuers. The issue for them is not finding the money. The issue is finding the real resources to prevent inflation, to make sure that you're not overheating the economy, that you're not, when all these resources that you would need, whether it's labor or raw materials or land, or if you don't have the infrastructure, all of those things are what matters. If you don't have those and you spend, well, then you're going to run into problems. You're going to run into inflation because the private sector is going to be competing with the federal government over this very finite group of resources. And that's really what matters, whether we have the productive capacity, whether we have the real resources to carry out whatever project we might want. And I was reading the end of a book by Stephanie Kelton, and it's made MMT, kind of put up MMT on the map, particularly during COVID, when we had all this new spending that people were unsure of where it came from, all this kind of stuff. She had a quote that she included from JFK, and in contrast to Margaret Thatcher, where I guess in his moonshot address to Congress, he was talking about all these things that we should be doing, and he never brought up taxing the American people more to pay for all this, the landing a man on the moon or whatever else they wanted to do. It was always the question was whether we're going to have the real capacity as a society to make these things happen. So.
Now you gave me a graph, and we have
Yes.
another slide that kind of shows what happens when the government spends and when the government doesn't spend.
Right.
So maybe we can show that slide, and you can talk.
Yes. So this is a graph of sectoral balances from. This is actually from Stephanie Kelton's. I took it. I hope she doesn't mind, but I took it from.
We'll attribute it to her.
I attributed it to her. It's from Finding the Money, which is a documentary that came out just a couple years ago, kind of as a, supplementary material to the deficit myth, maybe. It's separate, but it's a documentary. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it on Roku, Apple TV. It's really an excellent look at introduction to modern monetary theory. And you'll see in the graph, this goes from 1961 all the way to 2023. And the first thing that you should notice is, so on the top of the graph is government is
private sector.
well, the red is a government sector, and the black is domestic sector. So the top of the graph is surpluses, and the bottom of the graph is deficits. And so you'll see that when one is in almost for the entirety of our history, the government is always in deficit, and the private sector is always in surplus. If the only place that money can come from, and in contradiction to our friend Mrs. Thatcher, the only place that money can ever come from is the state. It's the currency issuer from its very inception 5,000 years ago. Money has always been a IOU by the state. And so when the government spends, it's necessarily going to be an asset. It's going to be a deficit for the government. It's going to be their red ink is our black ink. It's a concept that was called double entry bookkeeping. It came about during like 16th century Venice. If something is a deficit for one person, the other person who's receiving whatever that is, someone has to be in a surplus.
It's sort of like a zero-sum thing.
It is completely a zero-sum thing. And the other thing that you'll notice, there's a third element on that graph where the financial sector is in gray. It's kind of light. You won't be able to see it very easily. But the domestic private sector, the public sector, which is government spending, and the foreign private sector all have to add up to zero. And you'll see, so the government's red ink is our black ink. And when the government refuses to spend, when you talked about Bill Clinton, and everyone praises Bill Clinton for finally getting into a budget surplus for the federal government.
I blame Ross Perot in part, but
certainly.
whatever.
But a lot of people celebrate Bill Clinton for having that budget surplus. Well, what immediately happened after was a recession in 2001, and then afterwards the Great Recession in 2008. So when the government refuses to spend money into the economy, which is the only place that ultimately net financial assets actually come from, there's only one place for people to get money, to pay their bills, to purchase any goods and services with, and that place is only and always private loans, banks, and they're not net financial assets. You have to pay back those bank loans in full and with interest.
Right.
So those budget surpluses, those federal surpluses that Bill Clinton, is praised for, ultimately they came on the backs of massive amounts of private deficit, massive amounts of private debt, and it's ultimately what ended up tanking our economy. There's only so much private debt that the private sector can withstand before they don't have anything left to spend.
And looking at that graph, the red and the black are almost mirror images of each other.
It is an excellent point to remember. They are. They have to be mirror images of each other. And it's something that Stephanie Kelton puts in as kind of her motif as in Finding the Money. She has a reflection of a mountain that's being reflected in a lake. But you'll also notice that there have only been, I think, 7 times where we've had budget surpluses in the United States, federal budget surpluses. Every single time we've had a recession afterwards. Andrew Jackson maybe is the most famous occurrence where he refused to validate Second Bank of Congress, and he tried to pay down, or ultimately did pay down the entire national debt. And we had the Panic of 1837, maybe the worst depression in American history. Ultimately, there's only one place for money to come from. Even banks, like I mentioned, that they issue, when they issue credit, they are even agents of the state. They don't operate independently of the state. Their licenses come from the state.
So we've looked at that. Now, there are some real problems in our economy, and
Definitely.
there are sort of conventional solutions, and then the MMT-related solutions look a lot different.
That's definitely true.
So maybe, I don't know if it makes sense to look at some of these issues, like inflation.
Sure.
So
it is a big one, right? And a common misconception is about the common critique about people who usually will read second source material from MMT or about MMT will often make the claim, well, MMTers say that you can spend endlessly and without any consequence. It's actually the exact opposite. The inflation is the primary concern of people who study MMT. I mentioned, we can, the Keynes quote, we can anything we can actually do, we can afford. So inflation normally in our economy right now today is almost always, it's never a quantity of the money. That's something that Milton Friedman unfortunately put into our brains, and it's been very difficult for us to escape. The vast majority of inflation comes from corporations raising prices because they exist to maximize profit, not because they exist to maximize distribution or production even. They make excuses all the time for why they have to raise prices on things. We saw it during COVID. So we did have a massive amount of, we had all these blockages and supply chain issues, bottlenecks, but when they were solved, the prices still ended up going up. So corporations will always use the excuse of bottlenecks or whatever it may be. Government spending often. They'll often fearmonger about the government is going to be spending and then we're going to have to raise prices on your washing machine, or this grocery stores will raise prices because for whatever reason. The vast majority of inflation is due to what we call market abuse. Isabella Weber, she's not an MMTer, but she's kind of MMT adjacent. She had done a tremendous amount of work on what's called seller's inflation, also known as greedflation. We've heard the term a lot during COVID, and ultimately, one of the reasons why corporations are able to do this is because they also own our government. There's virtually no regulation of monopolies and oligopolies who actually coordinate among themselves. Companies will coordinate among themselves to raise prices at the same time, and then blame it on whatever excuse they can find. So while the conventional approach to inflation, we give the Federal Reserve basically one tool to maximize employment, to reach full employment, which is they actually don't even do. They pursue what's called NAIRU, which is a particular percentage of unemployment. They actually try to target a certain amount of unemployment to control prices, because they think that, well, the fewer people that have the money to spend on these things, well, then those prices won't be so high. So the Federal Reserve has kind of a dual mandate to full employment and inflation. And the only tool that they have really is controlling interest rates. But that doesn't actually solve the problem of real resources, doesn't solve the problem of productive capacity, it doesn't solve the problem of price gouging. All it does really, by raising interest rates, it makes borrowing more difficult. So you end up spending more to borrow regular people. And it will give those people who have interest-bearing securities more interest on their treasury securities, on their bonds, their notes, their treasury bills, all that kind of stuff. So as an MMT perspective, it's counterintuitive, but we think about actually spending more to reduce inflation, not less. It's not inflation isn't a function of the amount of money that we have flowing around in the economy, because we're not on a gold standard anymore. We're not slicing the gold pie smaller and smaller and smaller. It's about whether we have the actual goods and services that people need to buy, and if they're if those are in scarce supply, then you can reach, and everyone's competing for them, then you can have an inflation, certainly.
Now I've heard a lot of discussion among our more progressive leaders in Congress. The proposal for universal basic income.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I know that that isn't considered the answer because it throws money
Yeah.
into the world without anything to do with the money.
Yes. So MMT is not a set of policies. It's really what the way to think about it is it's a lens of analyzing our macroeconomics. It's a descriptive tool that accurately describes how federal finance works. So generally, MMT has very little to do with policy, but there are a couple of policies that an MMT lens would suggest. And one of them is a federal jobs guarantee. And it's usually paired with, instead of UBI, where you're just the government would be just sending out $1,000 checks to everyone every month, without controlling for market abuse or without increasing productive capacity, without actually ensuring that those real goods and services that people are going to want to buy with that extra $1,000 a month are going to be there. In contrast to that, we propose a federal job guarantee and to be paired with universal basic services. So healthcare, housing, education, along with a gainful job that would be federally financed. As again, like we spoke about, the federal government is not fiscally constrained, as opposed to currency users like states and municipalities, and even foreign nations that don't have their own reserve currency, don't have their own sovereign currency. The federal government can spend. There's no restriction to what the federal government can spend. So the federal job guarantee would be federally financed but locally administered. So here in Groton or New London, you would find we have millions of people who are out of work right now, and there are going to be millions more people out of work after when Trump is in the middle of his recession. So a federal job guarantee would flex with varying economic conditions. When we're in a recession and people are out of work, it would keep basically what we call a buffer stock of labor. That would always be available for to be employed by the public sector. And when those conditions are resolved, then it would contract again. There would be less need for, it was basically like a public option, right? You think of a public option for healthcare, and what it does is it serves as a what we call a counter-cyclical price stabilizer. So the one thing that goes into everything, all our goods and services, is labor. And by anchoring that price, you not only are making sure that people are gainfully employed and not destitute, not homeless, will be able to afford whatever they need to their bills or whatever else, because it would be set at a federal minimum wage of $15 or whatever. You could set it at $20, whatever you want, but you'd make sure that as that demand is rising for those goods and services that people would want to buy, as opposed to the $1,000 checks, people would actually be producing stuff. If you would be geared towards whatever parts of the economy need it most, whether it be housing or if there's a housing shortage and that's the source of inflation, well then you'd have people making houses, or food insecurity would be an issue.
And of course, healthcare you mentioned to begin with,
yes.
that is I hesitate to even call it a system at this point,
right.
That a lot of people don't have access to it.
Right. We pay more than any other country in the world for healthcare, private healthcare, and it gives worse outcomes Study after study has shown it's incredibly inefficient, and so it's a question of, what do you want our government to be? Who and for what purpose do we want our government serving? And right now, it's that extraordinarily inefficient and extraordinarily expensive, terrible outcome system ends up, benefiting insurance companies, private hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, all who have really captured our government and influence it to do what benefits those interests.
Well, and we'll talk more later about the political clout and who gets to make decisions about policy.
Yeah.
But in Connecticut, it kind of makes me crazy because under Governor Malloy, there were a lot of things he did that I didn't like. But one thing he did that was really extraordinary was that he made our Medicaid program public.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. I did not even realize that.
Yeah. He wanted to make a splash after such a long time of Republican governors.
Yeah.
I think O'Neill had been the Democratic governor before Malloy, and that was 25 years prior.
Sure.
So he made our Medicaid public, and since then, in that decade, the outcomes have gotten better.
Sure.
It's got very low overhead, 3 to 4% administrative costs.
Right.
And about a year ago, our current governor started to think, all the other states, except for 3 of them, have these, whatever they're called, middlemen companies.
Sure.
And why doesn't Connecticut? Maybe we should look into it. So we did form a panel that was kind of tilted towards the industry, but they really couldn't find much wrong with Connecticut's public Medicaid, except in a couple of areas of.
Right.
But there's still that. I've gone to meetings with one-payer states, national groups working on healthcare, and they're so envious of what we have in Connecticut.
Yeah. I'll say this.
It's threatened.
I'll say this. It's always threatened, right? By whatever administration comes in next. What I'd say to this is, and it goes to the difference that I might have alluded to earlier between currency issuers and currency users. The state of Connecticut is not a currency issuer. It can't print its own money. It doesn't have unlimited supply of funds, right? It unlike our federal government, it actually does have to tax or borrow in order to spend, and so it's fiscally constrained. And if it goes into a downturn, if we go into a recession, and it's spending its whatever it has in savings, that program is going to be under threat. And so this is often a common disagreement that we'll have. We love them to death, the people who talk about state by state Medicare for all and that kind of stuff. About I think there are maybe 3 states in the entire country that actually have the financial capacity to withstand the ebbs and flows of capitalism. What ultimately ends up happening. And from changes from one administration to the next.
That is a real problem, and we see it in Connecticut also, that state retirees who are on Medicare were all switched from traditional Medicare to Advantage plans about 6 or 7 years ago. And it wasn't the choice of the retiree. It was decided by the comptroller's office. And the reason really was kind of a need to play the game, because the federal government reimburses at a higher rate for Medicare Advantage programs. So the state saved a lot of money, not because they really saved money, but because the federal government was paying for a bigger share.
Which is and Medicare Advantage. I might be wrong on this, but it's a boon for private insurance.
Absolutely. There are a lot of issues with it.
Yeah.
I think PNHP did a press conference last fall about how those contracts are supposed to follow Medicare standards, and they don't necessarily.
I mean, ultimately, all this is a function of our federal government imposing public austerity on states, not funding them enough to provide. I mean, there's no necessity really for states and municipalities necessarily to impose taxes on their citizens. If the federal government funded them properly, if the federal government funded states and municipalities with grants and federal spending the way they, we might suggest that they would, the states and they still could. The states and municipalities still could impose taxes on real estate or whatever else as for other purposes, but they wouldn't necessarily need them to fund state programs. They could be all financed by federal government spending, and that for some people that might be scary about big government or whatnot. But when you're in a hole and you can't afford health insurance and you can't afford this and your state can't either. It wasn't very long ago that Connecticut was in a real fiscal crisis as well. We were on the verge of, and Hartford was as well, on the verge of going bankrupt.
Yeah.
And it's turned around, but those rainy day funds, I think that was what they call them. They're not necessarily there forever.
True. Maybe when talking about real issues too, maybe talk about Social Security,
Sure.
because people do pay into FICA during work years in
Right.
a very regressive way, I'll add.
Right.
And
Yeah.
why is it the way it is?
So back in 1935, when FDR set up Social Security, Social Security Act and SSA, there was, and we weren't that far away from Russian Bolshevik Revolution, and there was a lot of fear about socialism and a lot of fear about communism, all this kind of stuff.
Eugene Debs had gotten a lot of votes for president.
Eugene Debs was running for president from prison, and there was an enormous fervor for and for good reason, because capitalists really had crashed our economy. It wasn't very long, since the 1929 crash, and so there were kind of pitchforks at the gate, and FDR made a political decision. There were advisors who were telling him that he didn't have to fund Social Security this way, that they could just have the federal government funding out of general revenue. I think there was the Fed chair, FDR's Fed chair actually mentioned it specifically. But there's this great quote from FDR that basically where it wasn't directly quoted to him, but it was an advisor who was quoting a conversation that he had. He basically said that I'm using this method of revenue sourcing. It wasn't really revenue sourcing, but FICA, payroll taxes, to give a political, social, not obligation, but imperative for the people who are not even imperative, but reason for why they deserve to have these benefits. Some of the first social, not weren't called Social Security, but social benefit programs from Germany, from Bismarck, and that kind of stuff. They didn't impose taxes at all. But there was this fear of giving something away for free. And so the way that FDR rationalized it to Congress, or people were coming after him about the fact that all these programs that he was instituting were dangerous and that they're going to be, pushing us into a direction that we didn't want to go to, and giving away for free and stuff like that. The idea was that payroll taxes would be contributions that you were paying into and that you would get back later in your retirement. And that current employers are paying for future retirees. But it's slightly different. So you don't, when you get a Social Security check, doesn't come from the Social Security Administration. It comes from the U.S. Treasury.
It sure does.
Those checks don't come. Even the trust funds that we talk about, they're not actually funding mechanisms. They're really more like accounting devices. One of our MMT kind of leaders at Real Progressives like to use the phrase that they're kind of like if you've ever seen those kind of tracks that cars go over, that count the number of cars that go on a highway. The payroll taxes are kind of like that. They're a counting method of how much you've paid in your payroll taxes. But like all taxes, like whether it's their income taxes or corporate taxes or real estate, capital gains taxes, all federal taxes remove money from our economy. They don't actually fund anything. They cancel your obligation. Money is almost like a tax credit. In the same way that we talked about double entry accounting, that if one person is in surplus, if one person is in deficit, if the federal government is in deficit, well then I'm in surplus. Well, when money is basically a form of government debt. It's an IOU that's issued by the state. And so when you make those payments into Social Security, those dollars don't go anywhere. They're removed from the economy, they're removed from circulation, and they don't fund Medicare or Social Security or anything else. And there's, it's ironic because there is a lot of talk in progressive circles about, well, we just need to raise the cap,
right,
and then everything will be fixed. One thing that does, the two things it does, I'd say. One thing is it maintains the kind of the farce that your FICA taxes are required to pay for Social Security, where the federal government, if it wanted to, it could fund Social Security payments out of general revenue. And the other thing it does, I'd say, is it maintains, as you mentioned, FICA taxes are regressive. I think it's like something like 7.5% out of every paycheck, and it creates this kind of frustration at the government.
And it's a fairly low ceiling of, you only pay on your first 100 and something thousand.
Right. And so usually when and Obama did this, for the last time that we had incremental reforms was 1983 with the Simpson-Bowles Commission, and where they raised taxes in order to finance they noticed that, well, we're going to have all these retirees who are going to be not going to be able to be paying in their FICA taxes as they normally would. Well, the issue is whether we have again, as I mentioned before, whether we have the real capacity to provide those goods and services to retirees when we have an aging population. It's not about whether we can find the money. The Social Security trust funds are really just accounting devices, and they're restricted by they give the legal authority for the U.S. Treasury to spend, and if the trust funds, if there isn't enough money in those trust funds, then they can't make the payments. They could just change the law.
Yeah.
They could just change the law saying, we'll make sure that those trust funds are full so that we can make all payments, or they could fund them out of general revenue. And to that point, Medicare Parts B and D, as in opposition to Social Security. That's the way they already fund them. And there's a trustees report from 2009 that basically says that. It does a comparative analysis of the the Social Security trust funds and the supplemental medical insurance trust funds, which say, well, we're not going to be able to. There's we don't have the legal authority to make Social Security payments unless the trust funds are in the positive. But for Medicare Parts B and D, we are paying out of general revenue. There is no fiscal crisis whatsoever.
Wow, interesting. Okay, so the government doesn't need our taxes to fund things.
Nope.
But there are reasons for taxation.
That's definitely
so maybe we can talk a little bit about the reasons for taxation.
Excellent. So the first and probably the one that a lot of people never even think about goes all the way back to the first money that we ever had. And that's, it creates demand for the currency. If we didn't have taxes, if we didn't have any federal taxation at all, our value of the currency would drop to zero. It's taxation, federal taxation specifically, taxation to currency issuers. It is what keeps you needing the dollar. You can only pay your tax, and this is going to come up. It's going to be aired on tax day. You can't pay your taxes in Bitcoin. You can't pay your taxes in euros. You can't pay your taxes in wood chips. You can only pay your taxes in U.S. dollars. And so what that does is it makes you unemployed. The first tax that was issued made the states or the government authorities, citizens, reliant on that tax, finding those tax dollars somewhere in the economy in order to pay them back. So the tax impose an obligation on the citizens, which they can only cancel that obligation out unless you want to go to prison, unless you want to be have some kind of legal recourse. You can only pay those back by working in the economy to find those dollars, and everyone else needs those dollars because everyone has to pay their taxes, whether it's a corporation, whether it's a U.S. citizen. Everyone needs them to pay their taxes. So the first is to create demand for a currency. Second would be, and this is we commonly think about all the time, it's to control wealth and income distribution. And we have extraordinarily concentrated wealth in the United States, obviously. I mean, at levels we haven't seen since the Gilded Age, that create the oligarchic conditions that we have, where a government has control of where corporations have control of our government. Extreme wealthy, the billionaire, the oligarch class. So we don't tax the billionaires because we need to fund healthcare, or because we need to solve the energy crisis, or I think of the Green New Deal. There isn't enough.
Oh, and he put up the slide.
Oh, yes. So yeah, here we have.
Perfect. Thank you, Drew.
This was I made this graph when I was volunteering for a different organization, not Real Progressives, but Wolfpack, which is a federal finance reform, electoral finance reform organization, where I did a lot of local work. But there was a Princeton study that was from 2014 from Gillens and Page. There were two professors who did a study. It's called Testing Theories of American Politics, Elites, Interest Groups, and Average Americans. And they did basically a statistical analysis of 20 years of legislative data. And they compared whether, what the bottom 90% representation would like, and what the likelihood of legislative likelihood of those policies would be, and it was nil. It's a flat line, complete flat line. And then that's in red, and but elite representation, which is capitalists, oligarchs, moneyed interests, special interests, when they want something done, it happens because they're the ones who fund our politicians' careers. They're the ones who get them elected. I mean, the amount of money that's flowing through our electoral system every 2 and 4 years is insane. I mean, billions and billions and billions of dollars. So when they say jump, that's what the politicians do. They'll and the vast majority of our laws are actually, and a lot of people actually probably do know this, they're not written by the legislators themselves. They're written by lobbyists, basically lawyers who are working for those special interests, working for those corporations. So, yeah.
And that's actually on every level of government,
It's true.
Planning and Zoning Commission.
Yep.
If we have are asked to create an amendment to our zoning regulations, occasionally it will come from the city,
Right.
but it usually comes from a
Chamber of
developer who wants to do
right.
a project.
Yeah.
So we have about 3 minutes left.
Oh, no!
Yes. So we'll have to have a part 2 at some point.
Yes.
It won't be so neatly on tax day, but maybe spend the last couple minutes telling people how they can find out more, because
Great.
this really just scratches the surface of what the lens is,
Yes.
and a little bit of how it trickles down through everything else.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, so we are Real Progressives. We're a nonprofit that seeks to educate the public, the general public, at the intersection of modern monetary theory and class analysis. So we like to say that if you don't understand macroeconomics through the lens of MMT, you don't really understand how our economy works. And if you don't understand class analysis, what we were just talking about before in terms of who the government works for, you will understand why certain policies are being pushed. So we call ourselves the center of intersection of modern monetary theory and class analysis. And our flagship podcast, we have a podcast that comes out every Tuesday morning around 8 a.m. It's usually on a wide variety of subjects. Our last week was on, it's called exploitation. So it was about this crazy inflation of egg prices and monopolization of markets and why that's happened. But we have a wide variety of topics that are political, macroeconomic, and all that kind of stuff. I'd also suggest checking out our Facebook group. Actually, you can you just search for MMT for Real Progressives on Facebook. We also have a Twitter or X link as well. We weren't able to fit it on there, but that's perfectly fine. There was so much on there. And the other thing I'd suggest is looking up this wonderful documentary that just came out that I'd referenced, that I pulled that graphic from, which is called Finding the Money. It was features Professor Stephanie Kelton, who is a Stony Brook professor of economics, and she does an excellent job. She and a bunch of other MMT economists doing a really incredible job of explaining all these concepts, way better than I could and in far more detail and completion. But yeah, I really appreciate your giving me the time.
Yeah, well, this was fun. It was illuminating, but I know that it's really surface, because anything you figure out how it filters through every transaction that happens, and it kind of makes one's head spin. I must say.
I know. You came to one of our podcast replays the other night, and you said head exploded. Yeah. And that's what happened to me too. It's counterintuitive, but once you start having these kinds of moments, and it's pretty incredible.
Well, thank you, Paul, for coming down to Groton.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
For all of you who are watching this, next week the guest is going to be Mike Alowitz, and he's going to be talking about student movements then and now. So that should be good too. So
Great.
we'll see you then. And thanks again, Paul.
Thank you so much, Rana.